Welcome to Faultline. I'm Crystal Mech. Yeah, I like the drug. You're not the first to notice. You might be asking yourself, what's all this nonsense? Well, this is kind of a pilot of a new web series I'm trying out, based off of a giant bomb list I made a couple years back, called Good Games with One or More Mechanics That Drive Me Insane. You can kind of get the gist of what the list was about just by looking at it. I took a game that was generally well received, and I talked about a feature or problem that exists within the game that sucked. I've been editing this list for a couple years now, mostly because I don't have a life, and this list has gone up to about 40 entries since then. So what I wanted to do here, I wanted to take this concept, right, and I wanted to expand upon it a little more, make it a little bit beefier, meatier, and maybe a little less embarrassing too. I don't know. Probably not. And so, Faultline. So here's how this show is gonna work. I'm gonna pick a game that's generally well received, maybe a little bit on the fence at worst. I'm not gonna go for the easy targets, trust me. Like games like E.T., they've been done in. I'm gonna take these games and I'm gonna point out their three biggest issues, their most glaring flaws. This is the main point of the show. I'm gonna be talking about them extensively. I'm gonna go in detail as to why they drag the game down, how I'd fix them, and then at the end, maybe I'll do my little wrap-up review, recommendation. That's not set in stone. I'm probably not gonna do that. We'll see. Hey, set in stone. Show's called Faultline. It's funny. It's fun. So this first game we're going to be talking about, yeah, I'm a couple months late for. Yeah, I understand that. Pretty much all the hype is dead. It's been picked apart ruthlessly by several hundred people now, and a lot of fans are definitely more towards the love it or hate it side of the spectrum when it comes to this game, but we're going to be talking about Yooka-Laylee. As someone who's beaten Banjo-Kazooie at least 3 times already, and has played the sequel more times than I can count, this game had me on the edge of my seat. I wanted to play it as soon as it was announced, and I backed it as soon as I could. So what exactly do I think about Yooka-Laylee? Well, it's definitely a game. It's definitely a game you can buy on Steam. Yep, it's definitely a game you can buy, play with a controller, run around, jump, collect stuff. It's the game. It's Banjo 3, if you really wanted it, which I did. So, yeah, for real though, I honestly think Yooka-Laylee is pretty good. It's a nice little homage. It's a nice little homage to Banjo-Kazooie. It does most of the things that Banjo-Kazooie does, and it puts them in the modern age, gives it a nice little fresh coat of paint, and it has its own unique art style, it has its own unique characters. I think it's a harmless platformer that does its job very decently. But don't tell any of that to half the damn internet, Jesus Christ. This game was absolutely ripped apart by everybody I could think of. And I think a big part of that is probably because of all the hype culture surrounding it. This is just my personal opinion, but I believe hype culture is a breeding ground for failure towards even the best game. This might not be the best example, but let's look at the curious case of No Man's Sky. All we got was some footage at E3 of somebody flying through space and landing on a procedurally generated world with dinosaurs and mythical architecture, with vague buzzwords sprinkled into the mix, like people love, like crafting and open world, and the world just pissed itself with excitement. Those of us who were paying attention over the next year or so, however, knew that Hello Games were blowing an astronomical amount of sunshine out of their asses during interviews and other teasers. We saw a noticeable drop-off of content drip before the game's scheduled release date, and come time for its release, it absolutely tanked. Alright, bear with me. Let's take a step back, think about this from a different perspective. Say No Man's Sky had never even gotten a panel at E3. Say you hadn't even heard of the game until perhaps a couple of months or even weeks before it released. Nobody knew anything about it. Impossible, I know. Everything's leaking like a goddamn kitchen sink nowadays. And it just kind of poofed onto the Steam and PlayStation stores out of nowhere. People might still have seen it as garbage, alright, sure. But the blowback would have been more like a pinch on a shoulder rather than a wrecking ball to the testing. But no, that's not what happened. What would otherwise be called a mediocre exploration simulator by many instantly became one of the most infamous disappointments of our era. But why is that? I'll tell you why it happened. Because it was propped up on a goddamn pedestal, advertised to us practically as the second coming of Jesus Christ himself. The media outlets wouldn't stop gesticulating over it like freaking monkeys, and we wouldn't either. It's one of the most common problems of gaming today. We put all of our reason and our logic aside, and we drool like apes, and this creates an entirely new problem. We create astronomically large expectations that developers couldn't possibly meet. And honestly, if you think about this for a moment, this is consumerism at its finest. At this point, the developer doesn't even really have to think about expanding upon the game, because so many people have already decided that they're going to buy into it based on what was shown. Yes, as a long-term strategy, it's terrible. It sucks. It's like shooting yourself in the foot. But I guess there's quite a few developers who think maybe that's a good thing. Maybe there's like a snake on the foot or something, and it's like gummy action. I don't fucking know. No, I'm not saying we should get rid of it. And you know what? Honestly, I don't even think we can. It's basically human emotion. We can't help but get excited and mesmerized by this kind of crap. And trying to fight it with reason it's not always possible. I guess my main point that I'm trying to make here is that not a lot of people look past the shiny trinket on display to realize that the developer taking on the monumental task of building a procedural universal exploration simulator had the friggin' Joe Danger games in their portfolio beforehand. It's not rocket science. Their biggest success beforehand was the equivalent of a Trials clone. And no, it wasn't really a bad Trials clone, but still. This is like going from Bubble Bobble to making Skyrim. It's a recipe for disaster. Nothing good can come out of it. And yet, everyone, I'm literally everyone, all the game critics, all the news journalists, even us, the gaming public, we all fell for it. We completely ignored all the warning signs, and we just sat there and drooled. In that vein, I'm just not surprised at all that No Man's Sky ended up being this horrendous piece of shit. Well, to most people. There's some people who still play it, and I don't know what the fuck is wrong with them. Maybe it's not quite on the same level as No Man's Sky. I hope not to a lot of people. But Yooka-Laylee kind of emulates this. It has a similar case going for it. The developer is an upstart company, but it's made up of all these veterans who made the original titles. That sounds all fine and dandy, but you gotta remember, a lot of this stuff was made without a producer looking over them. So from this, I'm juxtaposing that their budget wasn't exactly the best upon leaving Rare, and the fact that they had to use the Unity engine to compile most of this game didn't bode well for them from the start. And yes, I know what some of you are thinking.
But Crystal Mech, they got 2 million of our pounds. They should have made a game that was worth 2 million pounds.
Look, they did not anticipate earning 2 million pounds so that they could develop this game. Maybe that was dumb of them. Maybe they should have scrapped the whole thing. Maybe they should have looked for a new engine to use. Maybe they should have used the Unreal Engine. Maybe they should have brought in a publisher sooner. I don't know. I don't run the company. The point is, they wanted 175,000 pounds to make the game, and we, once again, coming together and forming this big hype culture, gave them nearly 10 times that amount. We gave this money to 8 to 12 people using the Unity engine. And I don't care if you're John Romero or Ken Levine or Cliff Basinski or whoever the fuck. The point is, it's a small team using a budget engine to make the game. And somehow, almost everybody thought it was going to be the greatest thing of all time. Absolute horseshit. You look at other people, you look at other famous YouTubers like Video Game Donkey, Critical, Jim Sterling, they had absolutely nothing but sheer disdain and contempt for this game. But no, every time I play this game, I have a pretty decent time. All I see here is a game that was developed with good intentions and fell victim to its limitations and to a surging torrent of hype. I'm honestly completely fine with the $15 I paid for the digital edition. Although, I'm just gonna go ahead and say $40. It's just a bit too much. Man, what the hell am I doing? I'm supposed to be picking at this game's faults, not defending it. I'm confusing myself in my own damn video. Look, I guess I just felt the need to justify why I think this game isn't complete cock butter, like everybody else seems to think it is. So here we are. Yooka-Laylee, the dynamic duo of Bat and Lizard. There's not even any alliteration anymore. Bashing baddies and bereaving B-bosses of book besieging business. Buttocks, bum bowels. Where'd it go wrong? Oh, I've got 3 ideas.
Number 1. Controls bring you a step forward in the wrong direction.
Okay, so part of the charm in the progression of the original Banjo-Kazooie stemmed from the gradual introduction of new abilities that both Banjo and Kazooie could utilize to solve puzzles, defeat enemies, traverse the landscape, yada yada yada, etc, etc. But you see, the good thing about most of these moves is that, for the most part, they were straightforward and easy to control. When you learned them, the game told you everything you needed to know in order to use them properly. Fast forward to Yooka-Laylee, and there are several issues with the control scheme of the titular duo. Many of them involve the moves that you unlock and the physics engine tied to the game. This is terrible in a platforming game. It is paramount in a platforming game that the controls are practically spot on in terms of both cause and effect, responsive to every movement that you make. And you know, for general movement in Yooka-Laylee, it really isn't that bad. But when you get to the more intricate and complex parts of Yooka-Laylee's moveset, it starts to crumble apart and go downhill. The first bad omen for this game's control problems begin as soon as you start the game. You cannot even double jump or use your basic attack move until you complete the mandatory and terrible and stupid and boring tutorial. Alright, fine, sure. The original Banjo-Kazooie also did the same thing. You also couldn't use most of your moves as soon as you started the game. For 6 goddamn seconds! Because literally the second after you leave your house, you run into Bottles the Mole, and he gives you the option whether or not you want the tutorial to begin with. And if you refuse, poof, bam, there's all your moves. You can use them as much as you want. There's no restrictions. You can go right in. And the cool thing about it is, even if this is your first time playing, or if you just need a refresher on how the game works, you can do the tutorial, and it gives you a bonus for doing so. If you take the time to explore each of the tutorial levels, using the moves that you learn, you can gain an optional health upgrade at the very start of the game, and an extra life. So in Banjo-Kazooie, there's actually incentive to do the tutorial. But in Yooka-Laylee, there's almost none. The only tangible reward you get for completing the tutorial in Yooka-Laylee is 5 quills. And 5 quills is next to nothing when unlocking new moves. This ties in with another one of Yooka-Laylee's biggest issues, and I'm going to go into that a little bit more later on. So if you've looked around on the internet at some of these reviews for Yooka-Laylee, you'll tend to see that a lot of them mention that many of the mechanics in the game are outdated. But in my eyes, this isn't even the big issue with Yooka-Laylee. The big issue with Yooka-Laylee is that there are some mechanics that worked well in the first 2 games that absolutely suck here. Here's a good example of this. The combat. This is something that was a relatively minor part of the first 2 games, yet is one of this game's biggest issues. The issue here isn't necessarily with the controls or the button commands or anything like that. No, the issue here is with the hit detection. The first 2 games, completely fine. You press a button, you roll into the enemy, he takes maybe 1 or 2 hits, he dies, he drops health, it's all good. It's all great. You hear a distinct sound, you know you hit him, everything's fine. But in Yooka-Laylee, a large majority of the enemies take at least 2 hits to kill, have barely noticeable phases where they're completely invincible to your tail twirl attack. Your character isn't knocked back, which is usually the implication that you need to wait before you can hit them again. You don't get any indication whether you hit them at all half the time, besides a barely audible smacking noise and maybe a puff of smoke. Sometimes I don't even hear the hit sound play at all for some enemies, most notably the flying ones. And whereas in the original games where you get maybe like 6 or 7 different ways you can attack foes, here you literally just have your basic tail twirl attack and a terrible forward aerial roll that I swear sometimes doesn't even hit enemies at all. This makes this game's boss fights literally some of the worst I've ever played in a video game. The only indication you get that you've even hit these guys is sometimes dialogue pops up on the screen, and that's literally it. It doesn't even get better as the game goes on because the learned moves also have terrible controls. The first one you unlock is the reptile roll, and it's supposed to be analogous to the Talon Trot move you learned in the first level of the first game. Both moves are used for quicker mobility throughout the level and let you traverse up steep hills. The biggest difference between the 2 moves is that Yooka-Laylee's version of this move is completely abysmal and inferior in every single way. You could literally use the Talon Trot move in the first game until the cows come home. You could practically go through half the game using it. But no, in Yooka-Laylee, somebody decided it would be a good idea to tie the reptile roll into this really stupid special meter. It depletes while you use the move, so you can't even use the move for extended periods of time unless you collect specific power-ups that also act as health. Otherwise, you just gotta wait for the meter to recharge on its own by literally standing still and doing nothing, and it takes forever. The only reason, literally the only reason I can think of why they did this was to make maybe a couple of the game's challenges a little bit more convoluted than they need to be. I can sympathize with the fact that the developers thought they were doing good by taking away most of the collectibles required to use special moves from Banjo-Kazooie and Tooie, therefore negating the need to focus on gathering extra collectibles just for using moves. This is one of the big issues with the first and second games, and I'm glad that they attempted to correct it in this one. But there is also a way better and way simpler solution. Only use the special bar for moves that make sense with a special bar. It makes perfect sense for moves that would be overpowered otherwise to be tied to this meter, like the ability to fly or the ability to create some kind of supersonic shockwave that stuns multiple enemies at once. But for moving slightly faster, or a move whose purpose is literally just for finding secrets, there's pretty much no point. All it does is make the gameplay a little more cumbersome than it needs to be. Okay, once again, I think we're getting a little bit off topic. Let's just go back to the reptile roll again for a minute, because somehow it being tied to the special meter isn't even the worst part. The worst part is that the thing steers like a goddamn Mack truck. The first few times you use this move, you are almost guaranteed to end up missing turns, plummeting into the abyss, or running smack dab into some kind of level hazard. It's bad enough when you have to do races, beat the clock, and do timed ring challenges, but then you get an upgrade to the move later on that allows you to do a rev roll, which you need to do to smash through certain objects. But sometimes you also need to turn and, oh God, it's just so bad. We are 2 for 2 for mechanics that worked just fine in the first 2 games, and were somehow completely screwed up here. And this is literally one of the first abilities you unlock in the game. The rest of the abilities you find in the game, yep, they're just as bad. Many of them either use the damn special meter, control like puke, have hidden abilities or attributes that the game doesn't even bother to tell you about, or all 3 at once. I'm looking at you, Invisibility. You especially suck. How dare you? So in the first 2 games, some of the moves you learned necessitated the use of power-ups or pads scattered around the level so they wouldn't completely topple the game's balance in terms of difficulty. And you know what? For the first 4/5 of the game, Yooka-Laylee does well with this. But then, in the final stretch of the game, you unlock the ability to fly with literally almost no penalty. Okay, so the controls are a little bit bad for it, and it burns the special meter a little bit. And by a little bit, I mean maybe like a 20th of the meter a second. Look at how slow this trains. Look at it. Is that acceptable to you? I really, really would hope not. I think even toddlers would look at this and would probably agree that this makes the game way too easy and essentially ruins most of the challenges from the platforming for the last couple hours of the game. And since most of the stages are extremely vertically oriented, being able to just yourself right up into the air is completely overpowered. Okay, this one's a little bit nitpicky, but in the originals, you also had to seek out the move tutor within the level, be it bottles or jam jar. And this gave you a bit more reason to explore and rewards you promptly for doing so. But in this game, half the time, the move tutor Trouser is literally just sitting there out in the open in plain sight. And apart from him being very vague on what some of your learned moves can actually do, he also has a very annoying and, at the game's launch, unskippable dialogue box whose text couldn't be sped out every time you wanted to buy a move. Again, the system is annoying, and it's worse than the first 2 games. 3 for 3. True to the nature of the originals, there are transformations that you have to use to collect certain pages in each level. Untrue to the originals, most of them control like vomit as well. The first world's transformation is literally just a dumb looking plant. It has a really crappy attack and moves really slow. And every world beyond that, besides the third world, has some kind of vehicle that steers as well as a bathtub. You might be beginning to notice a trend here. And like I said earlier, the platforming controls are really solid for the most part. I don't often have trouble trying to get Yooka to move to specific places or jump across hazards, but when the game asks for more than that from me, that's when things start to go a bit haywire. And then there's also this fucking thing, the sentient minecart. Yeah, ugh. This actually leads directly into my next point.
Number 2. When minigames attack.
Alright, let's put the spotlight on another platformer that I think has some good elements, but faulty execution. Donkey Kong 64. Oh boy, I know a lot of you happen to have a lot of nostalgia for this game. Hell, I have a lot of nostalgia for this game. My idiot preschool self would play this game for hours and hours on it, and I remember it being amazing for the most part. But you know what else I happened to find amazing as a kid? The live-action George of the Jungle. I watched this movie like freaking 80 times. I don't know why. So, as you can imagine, due to Crystal Mech's childhood stupidity clause, my opinion then should be deemed invalid. Recently, as an adult, I opened the old vault, I dug this game out of the corner, threw it into my old console, played it all the way through this time, wrote an entire retrospective of the experience on GiantBomb.com, and guys, I'm gonna be honest, it was a pretty big struggle. Look, I'm not gonna be somebody who says that DK64 is a terrible game in every aspect, because it has a lot of good things going for it. The character models at the time were some of the most brilliant and visually appealing graphics one could perceive. It allowed you to utilize 5 different playable characters with distinct movesets. The game's soundtrack was par excellence to everything else at the time. game was chock full of content to uncover. It just so happens that a lot of this content was just badly designed. Pick any of the game's levels out of a hat and you'll realize that most of them just feel like segmented hallways, museum exhibits leading to landmarks seemingly sitting in giant rooms, and it completely breaks all immersion. The game was billed as a platformer, but half the time you're not even doing that. Most of the time you're just going around backtracking to areas multiple times with different playable characters just to collect menial trinkets necessary to finish the game. And if you're not doing that, you're doing something that either wastes a whole bunch of time or you're playing a minigame. Or both. The minigames wouldn't be so bad if most of them weren't god awful. A lot of them are either boring, way too difficult to control, or both. Hell, the game forces you to play through the original Donkey Kong arcade game on one life twice in order to reach the final boss. It's easily one of the more frustrating parts of the game, and it's the part where my kid self just completely gave up on finishing it. And it honestly really sucks because the final boss fight is arguably one of the best parts of the entire game, and it's really worth the pain and suffering much of the rest of the game puts you through. Yooka-Laylee takes after Donkey Kong 64 a bit too much in terms of minigames and optional objectives rather than the original Banjo games, and in my eyes that's just not a good thing. Alright, let's get back to the minecart with a face for a moment. He's one of the recurring challenges in this game. You can find him sitting around pretty much every level, and as you probably guessed, his challenges are pretty much the track-based vehicle levels from the Donkey Kong Country games. Yeah, you know, the ones that were universally acclaimed and all that. Except it's not even just that. It's not just surviving until the end of the course or even racing against time. No, you have to beat the track and collect a certain amount of gems, which can fall out of your cart if you get hit by something. So, in essence, it's a 2D version of DK64's Minecart Trials, which already suck. But this one somehow sucks even more, because the controls are completely shit. Every time you speed up or slow down, there's a delay before you can even do it again. So avoiding most of the hazards on the track while collecting most of the gems requires pinpoint precision. And if you fail, and you will on some of the later tracks, you have to finish the course and sit through mocking dialogue before you even get the chance to try again. And just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, you have to fight a boss on one of these tracks. And all the stuff I talked about before with the terrible hit detection, yeah, it applies here too. I don't even know how this is nostalgic to Banjo-Kazooie or Banjo-Tooie in the first place. Like, what are you trying to remind us of? The Canary Mary races? That's what you're paying homage to? The challenges that were pretty much the bane of every kid and completionist known to man? No, it couldn't possibly be that. It has to be something different. My best guess, as I alluded to earlier, is that they are an homage to the minecart levels from the original Donkey Kong Country games. Okay, first of all, that's not even the same series, and second of all, a lot of people hate those too. So really, logic just fails me here. I really don't know why these are even in the game in the first place. It's a prime example of how even a grassroots studio like Playtonic has trouble really connecting with its audience and figuring out what they want. Besides that, there's another set of more traditional minigames in the form of Rextro's arcade cabinets. Once again, every level has at least one, and they each require you to find a collectible before they can even be accessed. There are 8 of them in total, and the most enjoyable ones are kind of okay at best, I guess. Honestly, a lot of them don't feel a whole lot different from just playing the game normally. Some are just semi-isometric endless runners. Others just put you in an arena where you have to destroy a bunch of enemies. And my personal favorite, ironically, is the one where you ride in the minecart, except it plays more traditionally like some kind of RC Pro-Am successor. And yeah, the steering still sucks, but at this point, I've pretty much just gotten used to it. These would be mostly inoffensive, but all of them are required to be played twice in order to get all the rewards. And where have we seen that one before, am I right? And some of them just tend to drag on forever and ever, but that's a later point. We'll get to that. My main point is that none of them really managed to capture the essence of the original Banjo-Kazooie. In that game, most if not all minigames were tied directly into the main gameplay. Rarely were you ever forced to suddenly switch to some different control scheme or anything. You just did what you normally do with different rules applied. Like destroying Christmas creatures, attempting to munch on some twinkling lights, or using your ground pound to play the piano. Most of the minigames were built with the main gameplay in mind, not sacrificing the main gameplay for the sake of having them. That last point is an issue shared by Banjo-Tooie, Donkey Kong 64, and Yooka-Laylee all at once. Oh man, we got one more minigame to talk about. And it's the worst. And once again, it ties in with the final issue I have with this game, which I'll get to in a minute. This minigame, the thing that brought this game down an entire letter grade for me in terms of quality, is the Quackfire Quiz. Normally, quiz and video game are two words that don't necessarily meld well together, but I can name at least a couple examples of quizzes in video games that are actually pretty fun. I distinctly remember Paper Mario and the Thousand-Year Door having at least a couple of pretty decent quiz sections. And the original Banjo games, of course, have Grunty's Furnace Fun and the Tower of Tragedy. I'm gonna put a little bit more emphasis on Grunty's Furnace Fun, because while Tower of Tragedy was a decent, if not a little bland trivia game, Grunty's Furnace Fun once again incorporated it into the main gameplay. Instead of just ringing in and answering questions on a podium, you walked around a gigantic board in real time with spaces that gave you themed trivia about the game. Sometimes instead of general potpourri, you would get an audio or picture quiz. If you got a question wrong, you took a unit of damage or you were dumped into the instant kill lava. The really cool thing about Furnace Fun was the fact that you could not only take multiple paths to the end goal, but there were also side paths that you could take that were much more dangerous and risky, but allowed you to gain bonuses like extra lives and other collectibles. This made the segment very interesting and added somewhat of a strategic element and a little bit of replay value to it. So what did Playtonic do to attempt to emulate this in Yooka-Laylee? I'll tell you what they did. They took literally everything that made Furnace Fun, well, you know, fun, and they threw it out the goddamn window. We talked about gameplay mechanics that were in the original Banjo-Kazooie that were ruined when they were brought over here. This one is literally the worst of all of them. Allow me to explain a bit. Furnace Fun was introduced at the very tail end of Banjo-Kazooie when you played the game for at least a few hours. So imagine my surprise when the first Quackfire quiz you encounter in this game appears right at the goddamn start. Right after the first level. Why here? I just started playing the game 30 minutes ago. I don't even know half the characters. Maybe this could be forgiven, but the Quackfire quizzes are not even remotely in the same league of fun or intrigue as Furnace Fun. You're stuck on a straightaway path with a maximum of 10 to 12 questions per board, all of which are potpourri. Sure, you still get the audio and picture quizzes, but they're mixed into the rest of the questions this time. You don't get to choose. And some of them ask you some really stupid and obtuse questions, like which of these 3 identical looking characters is named Mo, or how many fucking quills have you collected? Yes, it asks you questions about your item totals. Even if you get a question right, you have to sit there and watch an unskippable scene in which Yooka slowly walks toward the next platform, and you're only allowed to miss 3 questions in total, and if you do, you lose and you have to start the whole thing over again. Answering quickly enough gets you kind of a bonus where you get to walk 2 steps forward, but it doesn't make it any more enjoyable. And no, I didn't misspeak earlier. I said first. This is the first of many quizzes that you have to go through in order to finish the game. It is soul crushingly boring, immensely annoying, a huge downgrade from the first 2 games, and in my opinion is the single worst part of this game. Furthermore, there's another large issue with the Quackfire quiz that sticks out like a sore thumb and segues quite well into my last point, actually.
Number 3. Can I just play now, please?
The Quackfire quizzes are just one of many painstaking examples of points in this game that are deliberately designed to waste your goddamn time and pad out the length of the game. I'm gonna give Playtonic some credit because they did attempt to rectify this issue somewhat. A recent patch allows you to skip a lot of the dialogue by pressing the Y button, and kudos to them. But again, this was something in the original Banjo game that wasn't in Yooka-Laylee at launch. So to put things in perspective, if you were playing this game at launch, or you bought it now and can't access any updates for it, you have to sit there and wait for Dr. Quack to explain the rules. You have to wait for Dr. Quack to belt the question out. Once you answer the question, you have to wait for Dr. Quack to finish insulting you or accusing you of cheating. And then you have to wait for Yooka to traipse on forward and get to the next space. Rinse, lather, repeat a minimum of 5 times. Fun! And guess what other game had this issue? Donkey Kong 64. Levels mostly featuring long stretches of hallways interspersed with collectibles that require extensive amounts of backtracking and tedium, minigames that went on for far longer than they needed to, inconsistencies with cutscenes and dialogue that sometimes can and sometimes can't be skipped. Maybe Yooka-Laylee doesn't quite share the first issue so much, except for maybe the expanded portion of the second level that was really dull and maze-like, but those latter 2 points are ever so present in the design of this game. If you were listening at all earlier, then you may have noticed that a lot of the key issues I covered deal with the interruption of game progression. Things like the unskippable tutorial or spurts of dialogue that until recently you couldn't even speed through. All of these elements bring the game's pace to a grinding halt. This was something that was practically never an issue for me in Banjo-Kazooie, and to a little bit of a lesser extent Banjo-Tooie. And the padding also kind of subsists throughout the gameplay as well. I want you to take a look at this riveting sequence of gameplay in one of the sections of Capital Casino. I've already talked about a slew of issues regarding the special move meter and the lack of instruction on behalf of moves such as the one I need to use here, so I'm just going to play this part in real time and give you an idea of pretty much how long this section took when it really had no reason to. Do you see what I mean? This is just obnoxious. I'm not going to torture you and make you watch the whole thing, but from that little snippet of gameplay, you should be able to identify what the problem is with a surprisingly dense packet of this game's content. And there are a lot of minor nitpicky things too, like how Dr. Puzz's transformations always involve you going through a dialogue box and playing out an animation, which, okay, I'll be fair, the first 2 games also had this issue, but as many critics have already pointed out, this is one of those issues that was never solved or ever even considered during the development of this game. I'm just saying, if there's something you need to take away from all this, it should be that whereas Banjo-Kazooie and Tooie hardly ever interrupted the main action and always made you feel like the stuff you were doing had a purpose, Yooka-Laylee struggles immensely in certain areas with holding the player's attention and keeping them invested in wanting to progress. Mac Addendum. Okay, look, I know my tone has been really harsh and befitting of somebody who seems to be extremely distraught and volatile against this game. I've had a lot of choice words, and it kinda does seem a little bit silly that I went from defending this game earlier to picking apart its biggest scabs ruthlessly. But I genuinely do think this game, much like Donkey Kong 64, while maybe not a premier package overall, has some good elements going for it. I think the charm and the humor of the previous titles is still apparent and on display here very well. The character designs, while essentially portmanteaus of Banjo-Kazooie's cast, are unique and have tons of personality. I think Grant Kirkhope and David Wise did a great job with the soundtrack. And with Microsoft continuing to seal up their gold mine of old rare IPs and not look back, it's honestly refreshing for me to have a game like this in the modern era. It does a decent enough job of scratching the collectathon itch, but there is just so much room for improvement. And to be fair, a recent patch fixed a lot of this game's glaring issues, including some of the ones I had with the pacing. But the development cycle lasted at least a year, so it's really confusing why most of these issues weren't ironed out during the main phase of development. I really do hope that Playtonic takes all the criticisms and the analysis into consideration and manages to do something really, really special with this genre. I will say that they have their work cut out for them because it's going to be hard to compete with some of the other platforming big shots on the market right now. Crash Bandicoot just made a comeback with his excellent remastered trilogy, and the upcoming Mario Odyssey looks like the paradigm of 3D platforming and gaming. So hopefully, if it ever comes to fruition, Yooka-Laylee learns a lot from its predecessor and becomes one of the best platformers available on Steam. And if not, well, whatever, we're not missing out on much. Hey there, thank you so much for watching this video. It's been a long time, and I'm glad to be back on YouTube. I had a lot of fun making this, and I'd really like to know if you guys would like to see more in the future. If you do, please hit the like button and hit subscribe, and if you want, leave a comment below. It would really help me get noticed, and I would really appreciate it. Have I said really enough? I think I've said really enough. In the near future, I'm gonna hit you guys with an update video that's gonna explain a little bit of the future of this channel, so keep your eyes peeled for that. As always, I'm Crystal Mech. I hope you guys have a safe, wonderful, and drug-free evening. Honestly, I really don't even care if you do drugs. Just don't do meth. Just please don't do meth.